If I could go back to that weekend, I would. I would hit pause before everything spiraled, rewind to the moments when I still had a choice. But life doesn't give you that, does it? Choices get made, and then you live with them. Or try to. It started simply enough. A Saturday afternoon, family gathered around the patio table, the air warm and sticky in that way only early summer can feel. My husband, Mark, was at the grill, laughing a little too loudly at some story his brother was telling. My son, Ethan, had his friends over, something I encouraged because I liked having the noise of youth around. It made the house feel alive again, or maybe it was selfish. Maybe I liked pretending I was part of it somehow. That's when I noticed him, Luke. He wasn't the loudest or the tallest in Ethan's group, but there was a stillness about him, a quiet confidence that pulled your eye whether you meant to look or not. He sat off to the side of the group, nursing a beer and watching the chaos unfold around him like he was taking mental notes. Dark hair that curled just slightly at the ends, broad shoulders that hinted at strength but not bulk, and his eyes, God, those eyes, green and sharp, the kind of gaze that made you feel seen even when you didn't want to be. I caught myself staring, just for a second, but then his gaze flicked to mine, and I felt it like a jolt, a heat that climbed my neck and flushed my cheeks. I busied myself with a plate of appetizers, shaking off the moment like it hadn't happened. "You okay, Mom?" Ethan's voice brought me back. He grinned at me, a half-eaten slider in his hand. "You look flushed." "Hot by the grill," I lied, motioning to Mark, who was still flipping burgers with the enthusiasm of a man who thought he was hosting a Food Network special. But when I glanced back at Luke, he was still watching me, not in a way that felt leering or obvious, just curious. And maybe that's what got to me, that curiosity. The rest of the afternoon passed in a haze of clinking glasses and shouted stories. I played the role I always do, smiling wife, supportive mother, hostess who refills drinks and clears plates before anyone can notice they're empty. I did it all on autopilot, feeling detached from myself, as though I were observing the whole scene from above. It wasn't until later, when the sun dipped low and the crowd thinned, that I found myself alone in the kitchen. I was rinsing glasses when Luke wandered in, beer bottle in hand. He leaned casually against the counter, his presence filling the room in a way that made it feel smaller. "You've been working hard all day," he said, his voice smooth and even. I glanced at him, surprised by the directness. "That's what moms do," I said lightly, shrugging as I dried my hands on a dish towel. His lips quirked into a small, knowing smile. "Doesn't mean you shouldn't enjoy yourself." The comment hung in the air between us, heavier than it should have been. I searched for something to say, something that wouldn't sound foolish or too eager, but the words escaped me. Then Ethan's voice called from the yard, snapping the tension. "Hey, Luke! You in there?" Luke held my gaze for a moment longer, and then he smiled, an easy, disarming smile, and pushed off the counter. "Coming," he called back, walking away without another word. I exhaled, realizing only then that I'd been holding my breath. The house felt quieter after everyone left, though it wasn't really empty. Mark was asleep on the couch, his snores cutting through the stillness, and Ethan was upstairs, likely texting one of his friends about the night. I lingered in the kitchen, aimlessly wiping down counters that were already clean. It wasn't that I enjoyed tidying. I just wasn't ready to go to bed. My thoughts were too loud, restless in a way I couldn't quite explain. Luke's voice played in my mind. "Doesn't mean you shouldn't enjoy yourself." What had he meant by that? Maybe it was nothing, a passing comment, but it didn't feel like nothing, and I hated that it stuck with me, as if those few words held more weight than they had any right to. I shook my head and forced myself to focus. A glass of wine, that's what I needed, something to calm the hum under my skin. I poured a generous amount and took it to the patio, where the evening air was cool against my arms. The garden lights cast a soft glow over the yard, and the faint smell of charcoal still lingered. It was peaceful, or it should have been, but then I thought about Luke again. The next morning, the house was back to its usual rhythm, or lack of it. Mark left early for a golf game, kissing me absent-mindedly on the cheek before grabbing his clubs. Ethan slept in, his door firmly shut, leaving me with the quiet monotony of a Sunday morning. I filled the time with chores, though my mind kept drifting, to Luke, to how he'd leaned against the counter, his voice low and casual, his presence unsettling in a way that wasn't entirely unwelcome. By mid-afternoon, Ethan emerged from his room, groggy and hungry. "Luke left his sunglasses," he said between bites of cereal. "I told him he could swing by later to grab them." My chest tightened, though I kept my expression neutral. "Oh, okay, when's he coming?" Ethan shrugged. "He said around 4. I nodded, forcing my hands to stay steady as I folded a dish towel. It was nothing, just a quick visit. But why did the thought of seeing him again make my heart race? At 4:10, the doorbell rang. Ethan shouted from upstairs, "Can you get that, Mom? I'm in the middle of something." I opened the door to find Luke standing there, his easy smile already in place. He held up his phone, showing a message from Ethan. Said you'd have my sunglasses? I stepped aside to let him in. He must have left them in the living room. 1 second. As I turned to look, he followed me inside, and suddenly the space felt charged again. His presence was magnetic, and I hated how acutely aware of him I was. The way his footsteps sounded on the hardwood, the faint scent of his cologne lingering in the air. Here they are, I said, grabbing the sunglasses from the side table. I handed them to him, careful not to let our fingers brush. Thanks. He hesitated, looking at me with that same curious expression he'd had the day before. You always this busy? I laughed softly, unsure how to respond. It's a mom thing. Maybe, he said, slipping the sunglasses into his pocket, but I think there's more to you than that. The comment hit me like a spark, unexpected and too close to the truth. I opened my mouth to respond, but Ethan's footsteps thundered down the stairs, breaking the moment. Hey man, Ethan greeted him, oblivious to whatever had just passed between us. The two of them fell into easy conversation, and I used the opportunity to retreat to the kitchen, my heart pounding for reasons I couldn't or wouldn't name. I busied myself with peeling potatoes in the kitchen, a task so mundane it should have grounded me. Instead, my hands trembled slightly as I worked, my mind stubbornly replaying Luke's words. There's more to you than that. A simple comment, but it had pierced through me like a question I hadn't dared to ask myself in years. What was left of me? The answer wasn't comforting. My days blurred together, cleaning, cooking, smiling through conversations with Mark that had no depth, no spark. Even my moments of joy, like Ethan's laughter or a quiet evening with a book, felt muted, like I was watching someone else live them. Luke had stepped into that haze like a flare. I hated that I was so affected, hated that his words lingered when they should have dissipated like all the other passing niceties people throw around. But it wasn't just the words, it was him, the way he looked at me, like I was more than the role I played. By the time Ethan and Luke left the house, off to meet another friend, I'd convinced myself it was nothing, an overreaction, a craving for attention that any middle-aged woman might feel when faced with someone young and magnetic. I needed to shake it off. There was laundry to fold, a grocery list to make, dinner to plan. Life didn't pause just because your brain decided to wander. But that night, as Mark lay snoring softly beside me, I couldn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling, every shadow stretched and warped by the dim glow of the bedside lamp. My mind kept looping back. Not just to Luke, but to everything, to how hollow things had become with Mark, to how the days felt like they passed through me instead of with me. I didn't resent him. Mark was a good man, steady, reliable, but something was missing, something I hadn't allowed myself to admit. I felt alive in a way I hadn't in years, and that terrified me. The next few days were uneventful, but the tension stayed. It was subtle at first, an extra glance at my reflection in the mirror, a few more minutes spent fussing with my hair before leaving the house. Small things, harmless on their own. I told myself I was just taking better care of myself, and wasn't that a good thing? But when Ethan mentioned Luke again, I felt that familiar flicker of heat. He's coming over Friday night, Ethan said over dinner, scrolling through his phone. A few of us are just gonna hang out. Maybe play some cards. You cool with that? Of course, I said, my voice as steady as I could make it. Do you need me to grab anything for snacks? Nah, we're good. Thanks, Mom. I avoided Mark's gaze across the table. Not that he would have noticed anything. He was preoccupied, talking about some issue at work. And even if he did look up, he'd see the same thing he always saw, a dependable wife, a mother who kept things running, nothing more. Friday came faster than I expected. I spent the day cleaning the house even though it wasn't messy. The living room was spotless, the kitchen counters gleamed, and I made sure the fridge was stocked with drinks Ethan's friends liked. It wasn't for Luke. At least that's what I told myself. When the doorbell rang that evening, I heard Ethan greet his friends, their voices spilling into the house. I stayed in the kitchen, feigning busyness, but my ears tuned into the sound of Luke's voice. It carried that same calm confidence, making it impossible to ignore. Hey, Mom, Ethan called. We're gonna hang in the living room. Okay. Let me know if you need anything, I replied, my voice light and casual. But when I peeked out from the kitchen doorway, my eyes went straight to Luke. He met my gaze briefly, offering a small nod before turning back to his friends. It was a tiny moment, one that no one else would have noticed, but I felt it. That night, I found myself lingering in the living room more than necessary, refilling the chip bowl, asking if anyone needed another drink. Each time, I felt Luke's eyes on me, though he never said anything that would draw attention. He didn't have to. The air between us was heavy with unspoken things, each glance and half-smile weaving a thread that tightened the space between us. I told myself it was harmless, that nothing would come of it, but deep down, I knew better. Friday night stretched on, the kind of evening where time feels syrupy and slow. Ethan and his friends sprawled across the living room, laughter and playful arguments filling the space. The TV flickered with a muted basketball game while they shuffled a deck of cards, the clatter of chips punctuating their jokes. I moved through the room like a ghost, picking up empty cans and tidying around them, pretending I wasn't lingering. I told myself I was just being a good host. I'd done the same for Ethan's friends 100 times before, but this felt different, and I couldn't shake the awareness of Luke. He wasn't the loudest in the group. That was Jason, with his booming laugh, but Luke had a way of drawing your attention without trying. He sat relaxed, leaning back on the couch with one ankle resting on his knee, his movements unhurried and deliberate. Every time I passed through the room, I felt his eyes on me. Not in an obvious way, but enough to send a subtle thrill through me, one I pretended wasn't there. At some point, Ethan noticed me hovering. "Mom, you don't have to keep cleaning," he said, laughing. "You're making us look lazy." I laughed it off, wiping my hands on a dish towel, just trying to keep the place nice for you guys. "Seriously, we're good," Ethan said, shooing me away. "Go relax or something." I nodded, forcing myself to retreat to the kitchen, but I didn't relax. I stayed by the sink, rinsing glasses that didn't need rinsing, straining to hear the laughter from the living room. Every so often I peeked out, catching glimpses of them, of him. Later in the evening, as the game wound down, Luke wandered into the kitchen. The others were still engrossed in their conversation, so no one noticed. He moved with a casual ease, like he belonged everywhere and nowhere all at once. I pretended not to see him, focusing intently on wiping down the counter. "Need any help?" he asked, his voice low and calm. I glanced up, startled. He was standing closer than I expected, leaning against the edge of the counter. The light above the sink caught the edges of his face, making his features sharper, his eyes greener. "Oh no, I'm fine," I said quickly, waving him off with the dish towel. "You should get back to your game." "They don't need me right now," he said, smiling slightly. "I figured I'd see if you needed anything." There was an edge to his tone, something unspoken that made my stomach flip. I laughed nervously. "I've got it covered, but thanks." He didn't move right away, his gaze lingering on me. "You do a lot for them. For everyone. It's what moms do," I said, repeating the same line I'd used before. It sounded thinner this time, less convincing. He tilted his head, studying me like he could see right through me. "I don't think that's all you are." The words hung in the air, heavy and electric. I felt my pulse quicken, and for a moment I couldn't look away. But then I heard Ethan's voice calling from the living room, shattering the moment like glass hitting tile. Luke straightened, the corner of his mouth twitching in something that wasn't quite a smile. "Guess that's my cue," he said softly before walking away. I stood frozen, the dish towel limp in my hand, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure someone would hear it. That night, after everyone had left, I sat in the darkened living room, staring at the empty card table. The house felt too quiet, the kind of silence that makes you feel hollow. Mark was already in bed, oblivious to everything, and Ethan had retreated to his room, exhausted from the night. I pressed my hands to my face, trying to make sense of the tangle of emotions inside me: guilt, confusion, and something else, something I didn't want to name. The memory of Luke's voice, the way he looked at me, wouldn't leave me alone. I wanted to shake it off, to convince myself it was meaningless, but deep down, I knew the truth. I wasn't ready to let it go. The weekend came and went in its usual blur of errands, chores, and polite exchanges with Mark that felt more like habit than conversation. On the surface, everything was normal, but beneath it, I felt restless, like I was waiting for something I couldn't name. I kept replaying Luke's words in my mind, the way he'd said, "I don't think that's all you are." How did he see me? I wondered. Did he see past the neatly folded laundry, the carefully prepared meals, the routine I wore like a second skin? I hated how much I wanted to know. By Tuesday, the silence in the house was unbearable. Ethan was at a study group, and Mark was working late again. I stood at the kitchen sink, staring out at the backyard, where the swing set Ethan had outgrown years ago stood like a forgotten relic. My phone buzzed on the counter, startling me. I grabbed it quickly, grateful for the distraction. It was a message from Ethan. "Luke's coming by to pick up a book I borrowed. Just a heads up." I stared at the screen, my heart skipping in a way that made me feel ridiculous. It was a simple message, nothing out of the ordinary, but it felt like a match struck against dry kindling. When the doorbell rang an hour later, I hesitated before answering. I smoothed my hair, told myself to act normal, and opened the door. Luke stood there, his easy smile in place, holding his phone in one hand. He was dressed casually in a gray t-shirt and jeans, but something about the way he carried himself made him seem older than his years. "Hey," he said. "Ethan told me to swing by." "Of course," I said, stepping aside to let him in. "I think the book's on the coffee table. He left it out earlier." Luke walked into the living room, his movements unhurried. I stayed by the doorway, unsure whether to follow or let him be. After a moment, he turned, holding the book. "Got it," he said, but he didn't leave right away. Instead, he leaned against the arm of the couch, his gaze settling on me. "You always this busy?" It was the same question he'd asked before, but this time it didn't feel casual. I forced a laugh. "Someone has to keep the place running." "Yeah, but do you ever stop?" he asked, his voice low and steady. I hesitated, caught off guard by the question. "Not really," I admitted finally. "There's always something that needs doing." He tilted his head, his eyes searching mine. "Maybe it's time to let someone else take care of things for a change." The words hit me like a punch I wasn't ready for. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. I felt raw, exposed, like he'd peeled back a layer I didn't even realize I'd been hiding behind. Before I could find my footing, he pushed off the couch and walked toward the door. "Thanks for letting me grab this," he said, holding up the book. "See you around." I watched him leave, my thoughts spinning. He'd barely said anything, but it felt like he'd left behind a weight I didn't know how to carry. That night, as I lay in bed next to Mark, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept drifting back to Luke's words, to the way he'd looked at me like he saw something I didn't even see in myself. I felt restless, caught between the pull of something dangerous and the safety of the life I'd built. For the first time in years, I didn't know which side I wanted to choose. By the following week, I felt like I was teetering on the edge of something I couldn't fully name. It was subtle, small shifts in my routine that I tried to brush off as coincidence. Spending an extra minute applying makeup in the morning, choosing a blouse that fit a little closer to my figure, lingering in front of the mirror longer than usual. I told myself it was harmless, that these little changes didn't mean anything, but I knew better. When Ethan mentioned he was having a few friends over again on Friday, I felt that familiar jolt of anticipation. I played it cool, nodding as I folded laundry. "That's fine," I said. "Do you want me to make anything for you guys? Maybe some nachos or something," he replied, not looking up from his phone. "Nothing fancy." "Of course," I said, as though my heart wasn't already racing at the thought of seeing Luke again. Friday arrived, and I spent most of the day cleaning the house, though it didn't need much. I told myself I was just being a good host, that I would have done this even if Luke weren't coming. But as I vacuumed the living room and adjusted the throw pillows, I couldn't ignore the tiny flutter of excitement in my chest. When the doorbell rang that evening, I felt the same pull I always did, the need to appear casual, unaffected. I stayed in the kitchen, letting Ethan greet his friends, though my ears were tuned to every sound. I could hear Luke's voice, calm and steady, as he bantered with the others. That voice had a way of cutting through the noise, commanding attention without trying. "Hey, Mom," Ethan called from the living room. "We're good in here. Let me know if you need anything," I replied, keeping my voice light. As the evening wore on, I found excuses to pass through the living room, refilling the snack bowl or collecting empty cans. Each time, I felt the same electric tension in the air, the subtle shift that happened whenever Luke's gaze met mine. He didn't say much directly to me, but his presence was impossible to ignore. At one point, as I reached for an empty plate near where he was sitting, he leaned back slightly, giving me space but also drawing my attention to him. "You really don't have to keep cleaning up after us," he said softly, his voice low enough that only I could hear. I glanced at him, feeling that familiar pull. "Force of habit," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. His lips quirked into a faint smile, and for a moment it felt like the rest of the room faded away. But then Jason cracked a joke, and the others erupted into laughter, breaking the spell. Later, as the night wound down and the group began to disperse, I found myself in the kitchen again, wiping down the counters even though they were already spotless. I heard footsteps behind me and turned to see Luke standing in the doorway, his hands in his pockets. "Heading out?" I asked, keeping my tone casual. "Yeah," he said, but he didn't move. His gaze lingered on me, searching, like he wanted to say something but wasn't sure how. For a moment, the air between us felt charged, the unspoken words heavy and suffocating. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but the sound of Ethan calling his name broke the moment. Luke glanced toward the living room, then back at me. "Good night," he said softly before walking away. I stood there long after he left, my hands gripping the edge of the counter, my heart pounding. I told myself it was nothing, that I was reading too much into things. But the truth was undeniable. This wasn't nothing. The following week was unbearable. I tried to throw myself into anything that would distract me, cleaning out the garage, reorganizing the pantry, even tackling a DIY project I'd been putting off for months. But no matter what I did, my thoughts always drifted back to Luke. His voice, his smile, the way his gaze lingered just a moment too long. It was maddening. I told myself it was wrong, that this fixation was nothing more than a byproduct of my dissatisfaction with my own life. But knowing it was wrong didn't make it stop. If anything, it only made the pull stronger. Thursday evening, Ethan casually mentioned that Luke was coming by again on Friday. "He's borrowing my notes for the econ class we took last semester," he said, scrolling through his phone while eating dinner. My stomach did a strange flip. "That's nice," I said, keeping my voice neutral. Ethan shrugged. "Yeah? He's been stressing about this professor. Says the guy's brutal." I nodded, barely listening. All I could think about was the fact that Luke would be in my house again. Friday arrived, and I told myself it would be just like any other visit. I stayed busy throughout the day, running errands and folding laundry, but I couldn't shake the nervous energy building inside me. By the time the doorbell rang that evening, my heart was pounding in my chest. Ethan opened the door, greeting Luke with a casual, "Hey man, come on in." I stayed in the kitchen, pretending to be absorbed in preparing dinner. I could hear their voices from the living room, easy and relaxed. I told myself I wouldn't go in, that there was no reason to put myself in the middle of their conversation. But when Ethan shouted, "Mom, can we grab some snacks?" I felt my feet moving before I could stop them. I brought out a tray of chips and salsa, placing it on the coffee table. Luke glanced up as I set it down, his eyes locking with mine for a brief moment. "Thanks," he said, his voice calm and steady. "You're welcome," I replied, trying to ignore the flutter in my chest. Ethan was flipping through a stack of notes, oblivious to the undercurrent in the room. "I think these are the ones you'll need," he said, handing Luke a thick packet of papers. Luke leaned back on the couch, skimming through the notes. "This is perfect," he said. "Thanks, man." "No problem," Ethan replied, already distracted by his phone. I lingered for a moment, unsure whether to stay or go. Luke glanced at me again, his gaze steady and unreadable. It felt like he wanted to say something, but the moment passed quickly. I forced myself to return to the kitchen, my heart still racing. The evening stretched on, and the quiet tension in the house was almost suffocating. When Luke finally left, I felt both relieved and disappointed. I sat on the edge of the couch after Ethan went to bed, staring at the empty room. This was getting dangerous, I thought, and yet some part of me didn't want it to stop. That weekend was filled with moments where I almost convinced myself I was imagining everything. I played back every interaction with Luke in my mind, searching for evidence that I'd blown it all out of proportion. Maybe he wasn't looking at me the way I thought. Maybe his comments were just polite, his attention nothing more than a side effect of being friendly. But there was no denying the way my pulse quickened when I thought of him. No denying how I felt when he was near, alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. And as much as I tried to push it away, the truth was clear. This wasn't just in my head. Tuesday afternoon, I found myself in the grocery store, aimlessly wandering the aisles. I had a list, but I barely glanced at it, my thoughts elsewhere. It wasn't until I reached the produce section that I saw him, Luke. He was standing near the apples, holding one in his hand, examining it like he was deciding if it was worth taking home. My heart leapt into my throat, and for a moment, I froze. He hadn't seen me yet. I could have turned around and left, pretended I hadn't noticed him, but something in me wanted him to see me. "Luke," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. He turned, surprised at first, but his face broke into an easy smile when he saw me. "Hey, fancy meeting you here." I laughed softly, stepping closer. Small world. He glanced at my cart, which was half empty. "You doing some shopping, or just escaping the house?" "Both, I think," I admitted. "What about you?" "Just grabbing a few things," he said, holding up the apple. "Trying to eat healthier." I smiled. "That's a good habit to have." For a moment, we stood there, the conversation light and unassuming. But there was an undercurrent, something that hummed just beneath the surface. The way his gaze lingered on mine, the way my body seemed to buzz with energy in his presence, it was undeniable. We ended up walking through the store together, talking about everything and nothing. He asked about my favorite recipes, and I teased him about his questionable choice of frozen pizza. It felt natural, easy, in a way I hadn't expected, but it also felt dangerous. Every time he laughed, every time he looked at me, I felt myself slipping further into something I couldn't control. When we reached the checkout lanes, I hesitated, unsure how to end the encounter. Luke noticed and smiled, leaning slightly closer. "It's nice running into you," he said, his voice low. "I don't see you relax much." I swallowed hard, the words catching me off guard. "Maybe I should work on that." "Maybe you should," he said, his gaze holding mine for a beat too long. Then he straightened, sliding his basket onto the conveyor belt. "See you around." I watched him walk away, my chest tight with emotions I couldn't quite name. When I finally left the store, my hands gripped the steering wheel of my car as I sat in the parking lot, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But there was no making sense of it. There was only the pull, the ache, and the quiet voice in the back of my mind that whispered, "This isn't over." The week blurred after that grocery store encounter, though I couldn't stop thinking about it. The way Luke had smiled at me, the easy rhythm of our conversation, it played over and over in my mind. I hated how much it consumed me, how it felt like a thread tugging at the edges of my carefully constructed life. By Friday evening, Ethan announced he was heading out to meet friends, leaving the house quiet. Mark had already called to say he'd be late, something about a work meeting running long. The thought of another long night alone felt both suffocating and oddly freeing. I poured myself a glass of wine and settled on the couch, trying to distract myself with a book, but my focus was shot. Every sentence blurred together, and before long I was just staring at the page, my mind elsewhere. That's when my phone buzzed. It was a text from Luke. "Hey, was thinking about that recipe you mentioned. Mind sharing it?" I stared at the screen, my heart racing. I should have ignored it. I should have let it go. But before I could stop myself, I was typing back, "Of course. Do you cook often?" His reply came quickly. "Not often enough. Could use some tips." I hesitated, my fingers hovering over the screen. This was harmless, I told myself. Just a conversation, but the flutter in my chest told a different story. "What kind of tips are you looking for?" I typed, hitting send before I could overthink it. "Depends," he replied. "What's your specialty?" The message felt loaded, though I couldn't tell if I was imagining it. I sipped my wine, my nerves buzzing. "Pasta," I wrote back. Simple but satisfying. There was a pause before his next message. "Sounds perfect. Think I could get a live demonstration sometime?" The words hit me like a jolt. I stared at the screen, my thoughts spinning. This wasn't harmless anymore, was it? This was something else entirely, and yet I didn't want to stop. "Maybe," I typed back, my pulse pounding, "if you're serious about learning." The conversation ended shortly after that, but the impact lingered. I sat on the couch, staring at my empty wine glass, trying to reconcile the woman I thought I was with the one who had just flirted, no, more than flirted, with her son's friend. It felt surreal, wrong, and yet it also felt intoxicating. When Mark came home later that night, he barely looked at me, muttering something about being exhausted before heading straight to bed. I stood in the living room, watching him go, my chest heavy with guilt, and something that felt dangerously close to longing. I knew I was standing at the edge of a cliff. I could still step back, still stop this before it spiraled out of control, but I also knew that part of me didn't want to, because for the first time in years, I felt awake. Saturday morning arrived heavy with the kind of stillness that comes after a storm, though no one else seemed to notice. Mark had left early for another golf outing. Ethan was still asleep, and I was left alone with my thoughts in a kitchen that felt too big, too empty. I decided to bake. Something about the process, the careful measuring, the rhythmic stirring, always calmed me. I sifted flour and cracked eggs, letting the motions take over, trying to drown out the noise in my head. But it didn't work. The conversation with Luke from the night before played on a loop, his words sticking to me like honey. "Think I could get a live demonstration sometime?" What had he meant? Was it just a joke, a playful tease, or was there something more to it? And why had I responded the way I did, like I was daring him to take it further? By the time Ethan woke up and shuffled into the kitchen, I'd finished a batch of cookies. "Morning," he mumbled, grabbing one from the cooling rack. "Morning," I replied, trying to sound normal. He bit into the cookie, nodding his approval. "These are good, thanks." I smiled, grateful for the distraction. "What's the plan for today?" "Not much. Might hang out with Luke later," he said casually, scrolling through his phone. The mention of his name sent a jolt through me, but I kept my expression neutral. "Oh? What are you two up to?" "Not sure yet. Probably just chill at his place or something." I nodded, focusing on wiping down the counter. "That sounds nice." Ethan shrugged, already lost in whatever was on his screen. He finished his cookie and wandered back to his room, leaving me alone again. The rest of the day dragged. I cleaned the house, went for a walk, and even started a puzzle, but nothing held my attention. When the sun began to set, the heaviness in my chest grew unbearable. I felt trapped, like I was pacing inside a cage of my own making. That's when my phone buzzed. "Luke, busy tonight?" I stared at the message, my heart pounding. This was it, wasn't it? The moment where I could still turn back. But instead of closing the app, I found myself typing a reply. "Not really. Why?" His response came quickly. "Thinking about that pasta lesson." I hesitated, my fingers trembling. This was dangerous, reckless, and yet, the thought of saying no felt impossible. "What time?" I typed, the words feeling surreal. "Now?" I glanced at the clock. Ethan was out with friends, and Mark wouldn't be home for hours. The house was quiet, and I was alone. There was no reason to say yes, no excuse, but I wanted to. "Come over," I replied before I could stop myself. When the doorbell rang, I took a deep breath before opening it. Luke stood there, casual as ever, his hands in his pockets and a small smile playing on his lips. "Hope I'm not interrupting anything," he said. I shook my head, stepping aside to let him in. Not at all. The kitchen felt impossibly small with him in it, the air thick with something unspoken. I reached for a pot, my hands trembling slightly. "Let's get started," I said, my voice too bright, too forced. Luke leaned against the counter, watching me as I moved around the kitchen. "You don't have to be nervous," he said softly. "I'm not," I lied. His gaze lingered, warm and steady, and for a moment, the space between us felt unbearable. "Tell me what to do," he said, his voice low, and I wasn't sure if he meant the pasta or something else entirely. The kitchen felt like it was holding its breath. I busied myself with gathering ingredients, rattling off instructions to Luke in a voice that barely sounded like my own. "You can start by chopping the garlic," I said, handing him a cutting board and knife. He took them from me, his fingers brushing mine briefly. The touch was electric, and I quickly turned away, focusing on the boiling pot of water as if it were the most fascinating thing in the world. "You're good at this," Luke said after a moment, his voice calm and steady. "Teaching, I mean." I glanced at him, surprised. He was focused on the garlic, his movements deliberate. There was something about the way he said it that made my chest tighten. "It's just cooking," I replied, trying to downplay it. He looked up, meeting my eyes. "It's not just anything, you make it feel easy." The words hit me harder than they should have. I turned back to the stove, stirring the sauce to avoid his gaze. "Well, I've had a lot of practice." "You're more than just practice," he said softly. My breath caught, and for a moment I couldn't move. The air between us was thick, charged with something I didn't want to name. I told myself to stay focused, to keep things light, but my hands were trembling as I reached for the salt. As we worked side by side, the tension grew. Luke was close, closer than he needed to be, and every time our arms brushed or our hands met, it felt like the world tilted. I could feel his gaze on me, warm and steady, and I hated how much I wanted to meet it. When the pasta was finally done, I turned to him, holding out a plate. "Here," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. "Try it." He took the plate, but instead of sitting down, he stayed where he was, leaning against the counter. He twirled a forkful of pasta, his eyes never leaving mine. "You've outdone yourself," he said after taking a bite, his tone almost teasing. I laughed nervously, brushing a strand of hair behind my ear. "It's just pasta, not the way you make it." The way he said it made my stomach flip. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. Luke set the plate down on the counter, stepping closer. I could feel the warmth of him now, the space between us almost non-existent. "You're different," he said softly. "You know that?" I shook my head, unsure how to respond. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. "You make people feel seen," he continued, his voice low, "even when they don't think they deserve it." I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, my pulse racing as the world seemed to narrow around us. "Luke," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He reached up, brushing a strand of hair from my face. His touch was light, tentative, but it sent a shiver down my spine. "You don't have to say anything," he said. "I just needed you to know." For a moment, I stood frozen, caught between the pull of him and the weight of everything I'd spent my life building. I knew this was wrong, that I should step back, stop it before it went too far. But I didn't move. I don't remember who moved first. One moment, we were standing there, the space between us charged and unbearable, and the next, Luke's lips were on mine. The kiss was soft at first, almost hesitant, as though he was giving me a chance to pull away, but I didn't. Instead, I leaned into it, my hands clutching the edge of the counter behind me as if it were the only thing keeping me upright. His hands moved to my waist, tentative but firm, and I felt the world tilt beneath me. Every rational thought I'd clung to dissolved in the warmth of his touch. When we finally pulled apart, the room felt too quiet, the air thick with everything unspoken. Luke's eyes searched mine, his expression a mix of vulnerability and something deeper, something I wasn't ready to name. I started, but the words caught in my throat. "You don't have to say anything," he said softly, his hands still resting on my waist. "I know this is complicated, the understatement of the century." I stepped back, putting distance between us, though it did little to calm the storm inside me. This can't happen," I said, my voice trembling. "It's not right," he nodded, his gaze steady but filled with something like regret. "I get it," he said, though his tone suggested he didn't entirely believe it. I turned away, running a hand through my hair, trying to gather my thoughts. "You should go," I said finally, not meeting his eyes. "Ethan could be back any minute." Luke hesitated, and for a moment I thought he might argue, but then he stepped back, grabbing his jacket from the chair. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, "for making things harder." I looked at him then, and the sincerity in his expression made my chest ache. "It's not your fault," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "This is on me." He gave me a small, sad smile before turning to leave. The door clicked shut behind him, and I sank into a chair, my head in my hands. The taste of his kiss still lingered on my lips, and the weight of what had just happened pressed down on me like a stone. The rest of the night passed in a haze. When Mark came home, I managed to play my part, pretending everything was fine. But my mind was elsewhere, replaying every moment with Luke, every touch, every word. I knew I should feel guilty, and I did, sort of. But guilt wasn't the dominant emotion. What I felt more than anything was a deep, aching sadness. Not just for what had happened, but for everything it represented. For the life I'd built that now felt so small, so confining. For the way Luke had made me feel seen in a way I hadn't in years. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I told myself it was over, that I wouldn't let it happen again. But even as I made the promise, a part of me knew it was a lie, because when I closed my eyes, all I could see was him. The days that followed were a blur of denial and self-discipline. I threw myself into every task I could find, deep cleaning the house, sorting through old photos, reorganizing the attic, anything to keep my mind occupied. But no matter how hard I tried, Luke's face lingered in my thoughts. The memory of his touch haunted me, an ache I couldn't shake. Mark didn't notice my distraction. He rarely did. Our conversations were brief, transactional, plans for the week, grocery lists, Ethan's schedule. We moved around each other like pieces of furniture, familiar but unremarkable. It was easier that way, I supposed. If he noticed the distance in my eyes, he didn't say anything. Ethan mentioned Luke in passing a few days later, while we were cleaning up after dinner. "Luke said thanks for the notes, by the way," he said, rinsing a plate. "Oh," I replied, keeping my tone casual. "Glad they helped." "Yeah, he's been really focused lately. I think he's trying to prove something to himself, you know?" I nodded, though my throat felt tight. "That's good. He seems like a smart guy." Ethan shrugged. "He is, just different from the others, more serious." The comment hung in the air, and I felt a pang of something I couldn't quite name. Guilt? Longing? Both? Ethan glanced at me, frowning slightly. "You okay, Mom? You've been kind of off lately." I forced a smile. "Just tired. Nothing to worry about." He didn't look convinced, but he let it go, retreating to his room a few minutes later. I stood at the sink, gripping the edge of the counter, my chest tight with the weight of everything I couldn't say. It was a week before I saw Luke again. Ethan invited a few friends over to watch a game, and I told myself I would stay out of their way. I wouldn't linger. I wouldn't let myself get drawn in. But when I heard Luke's voice drifting from the living room, that calm, steady tone that seemed to wrap around me like a thread, I felt my resolve begin to crumble. I stayed in the kitchen, busying myself with preparing snacks I wasn't even sure they needed. The clatter of bowls and the hum of the fridge filled the silence, but it didn't drown out the sound of his laugh. I carried a tray into the living room, my hands steady even as my heart raced. The boys barely glanced at me, too engrossed in the game to notice anything else, except for Luke. He looked up as I set the tray on the coffee table, his gaze meeting mine. It was just a moment, a flicker of recognition, a subtle shift in his expression, but it was enough to send my pulse racing. "Thanks, Mom," Ethan said absently, reaching for a handful of chips. "You're welcome," I replied, my voice calm, though I could feel the tension in my chest. I turned quickly, retreating to the kitchen before I gave myself away. Later, as the night wound down and the boys started to leave, I found myself lingering in the kitchen again, pretending to tidy up. I heard footsteps behind me and turned to see Luke standing in the doorway. "Hey," he said, his voice low. I swallowed hard, my hands gripping the edge of the counter. "Hey, I just wanted to say thanks for the snacks," he said, though the look in his eyes told me that wasn't the only reason he'd come back. "You're welcome," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence was heavy, charged with everything we weren't saying. Then, softly, he said, "Are you okay?" The question caught me off guard, and I felt my composure slip. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice trembling. "I don't know what I'm doing." He stepped closer, his gaze steady. "You don't have to figure it out right now." I shook my head, tears stinging my eyes. "This is wrong, Luke." "I know," he said softly, "but that doesn't mean it doesn't feel real." His words broke something in me, and before I could stop myself, I was reaching for him, my hands gripping his shirt as if he were the only thing holding me together. His arms wrapped around me, and for a moment, I let myself sink into the warmth of him, the weight of everything else fading away. But then the sound of the front door opening snapped me back to reality. I pulled away quickly, my heart pounding. "You should go," I said, my voice shaking. Luke hesitated, his expression torn, but he nodded. "Good night," he said softly before turning and walking away. As the door clicked shut behind him, I sank to the floor, my chest heaving with the weight of everything I couldn't undo. The next few days were a blur of guilt and second-guessing. Every time I replayed that moment in the kitchen, I felt like I was unraveling. I knew what I'd done, what I'd almost done, was wrong. But the memory of Luke's arms around me, the steadiness of his voice was impossible to shake. I avoided the living room entirely when Ethan was home, not trusting myself to handle even the casual mention of Luke. Instead, I threw myself into the safety of routine, scrubbing floors, rearranging cabinets, anything to keep my hands busy and my mind blank. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't outrun it. It was late on a Wednesday when everything started to crack. Ethan had gone out with friends, and Mark was still at the office, leaving the house dark and quiet. I was on the couch, half-heartedly flipping through a book, when my phone buzzed on the coffee table. It was Luke. "Can we talk?" My chest tightened, and I stared at the screen for what felt like an eternity. I knew I shouldn't reply. I knew I should delete the message and pretend it never existed. But my fingers seemed to move on their own. "What about?" His response came quickly. "Everything. I can't stop thinking about you." I set the phone down, my hands trembling. The words felt like a confession, a weight pressing against my chest. Part of me wanted to tell him to stop, to end this before it went any further. But another part of me, the part that had been longing for something I couldn't name, didn't want it to stop. The phone buzzed again. "I'll come by if you want." I closed my eyes, my thoughts a tangled mess. I wanted to say no. I needed to say no. But when I typed out my reply, it wasn't the one I'd rehearsed in my head. "Come over." 15 minutes later, the doorbell rang. My heart was pounding as I opened the door to find Luke standing there, his expression a mix of uncertainty and determination. He didn't say anything at first, just stepped inside and closed the door behind him. "You shouldn't be here," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. "I know," he replied, his gaze steady. "But I had to see you." I crossed my arms over my chest, trying to put up some kind of barrier between us. "This is wrong, Luke." "Maybe it is," he said softly, stepping closer. "But it doesn't feel that way." His words hit me like a punch, and I felt the tears I'd been holding back threaten to spill. "I don't know how to stop this," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. He reached out, his fingers brushing mine, and the warmth of his touch sent a shiver through me. "You don't have to figure it out right now," he said. "Just let yourself feel this. For once." I shook my head, the tears spilling over now. "It's not that simple." "Maybe it is," he said, his voice calm and steady. "Maybe you've just forgotten what it feels like to be happy." His words cracked something open inside me, and before I could stop myself, I was reaching for him, pulling him close. His arms wrapped around me and the world seemed to tilt as I let myself sink into him, the weight of everything else fading away. That night, as the house lay quiet and still, I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the darkened window. I knew I'd crossed a line, one I couldn't uncross. The guilt was there, heavy and suffocating, but so was something else, a quiet, desperate longing I hadn't felt in years. I didn't know how to reconcile the two. I didn't know if I even could. All I knew was that something inside me had changed, and there was no going back. The next morning, the weight of what had happened hit me like a tidal wave. The house felt too quiet. Every creak of the floorboards and hum of the fridge amplified in the stillness. I stood in the kitchen, gripping a mug of coffee, staring at the back door like it held the answers to the questions I couldn't even articulate. What was I doing? What kind of person had I become? Mark was at work, Ethan was at class, and the solitude gave my thoughts free rein to spiral. I told myself I had to end this, to cut off whatever it was with Luke before it destroyed everything. But the memory of his touch, the way he'd looked at me like I mattered in a way I hadn't felt in years, was impossible to shake. That evening, Ethan was unusually quiet at dinner, picking at his plate as though he had something on his mind. I tried to focus on the routine, serving food, asking about his day, but the tension between us was palpable. "Is everything okay?" I asked finally, my voice careful. He hesitated, his fork hovering over his plate. "I don't know," he said, not meeting my eyes. "You've just been different lately." "Different how?" I asked, my heart racing. "I don't know," he repeated, frowning. "You just seem distracted, like you're not really here." I forced a smile, though it felt brittle. "I've just been tired, that's all. Nothing to worry about." He studied me for a moment, as if trying to decide whether to believe me, then nodded slowly. "Okay," he said, though his tone was uncertain. The conversation left me rattled. I couldn't let this go on, couldn't risk Ethan or anyone else seeing through the cracks. I had to take control before everything fell apart. The next time Luke texted, I didn't respond. It was harder than I expected. Each buzz of my phone like a siren call I had to fight against. He sent a few more messages, each one a little more insistent, but I deleted them without reading. It was the only way to keep myself from falling back into the spiral, but avoiding him didn't make the ache go away. If anything, it made it worse. I felt restless, empty, like I was going through the motions of a life that no longer fit. And no matter how much I tried to push it aside, the memory of Luke lingered, a constant gnawing presence. A few days later, Ethan came home from a night out with his friends, his expression dark. I was in the kitchen, cleaning up after dinner when he dropped his bag on the counter with a heavy thud. "Everything okay?" I asked, glancing at him. He didn't answer at first, his jaw tight. Then finally he said, "Luke's been acting weird." My chest tightened. "Weird how?" "I don't know," Ethan said, running a hand through his hair. "He's just distant, like he's hiding something." I forced myself to stay calm, though my pulse was racing. "Maybe he's just busy." "Maybe," Ethan said, though he didn't sound convinced. He grabbed a soda from the fridge, his movements tense. "It's just not like him, that's all." I nodded, keeping my face neutral, but the weight of his words settled heavy in my chest. This was spiraling faster than I'd anticipated, and I was running out of ways to contain it. That night, I sat in the darkened living room, staring at my phone. Luke's name was still there in my messages, the unread texts like tiny landmines waiting to explode. I knew I should delete them, block his number, cut him out completely, but my finger hovered over the screen, unable to follow through, because as much as I wanted to let go, I didn't know how. I woke the next morning with a sinking feeling, as if I were bracing for something I couldn't quite name. The tension between Ethan's suspicions and Luke's silence had been gnawing at me for days. Avoiding Luke felt like the right thing to do, but it hadn't brought me the relief I'd hoped for. Instead, it left a void, a gnawing emptiness that only deepened the sense of inevitability creeping over me. That afternoon, everything came crashing down. Ethan was in his room when I heard the front door open. I assumed it was Mark, but when I turned to look, Luke was standing there. My heart dropped. He looked different, tense, almost defiant, like he was carrying something heavy he'd finally decided to set down. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low. "Luke, you can't just show up here," I hissed, glancing toward the hallway where Ethan's door was slightly ajar. "This isn't the time." "When is the time?" he shot back, his voice sharper than I'd ever heard it. "You won't answer my texts. You won't let me explain." "There's nothing to explain," I interrupted, keeping my voice quiet but firm. "This was a mistake. It has to end." His jaw tightened, and for a moment, he didn't respond. Then, almost as if he couldn't help himself, he said, "It didn't feel like a mistake." The words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to detonate. I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, a voice from behind me cut through the tension like a knife. "What's going on?" I turned, my stomach dropping as I saw Ethan standing at the end of the hallway, his expression a mix of confusion and suspicion. He glanced between us, his eyes narrowing as he tried to piece together what he'd just walked into. "Nothing," I said quickly, forcing a smile. "Luke was just—" "Don't," Luke said, cutting me off. His gaze was steady, but his voice wavered slightly. "Don't lie to him." "Lie to me about what?" Ethan asked, his voice rising. He stepped closer, his confusion giving way to anger. "What the hell is going on?" I froze, my mind scrambling for an answer, but the truth was already bubbling to the surface. I could see it in Ethan's eyes, the way his gaze darted between Luke and me, the realization starting to take shape. "You've got to be kidding me," he said, his voice trembling with disbelief. "Mom, Luke, Ethan, it's not what you think." I started, but the words felt hollow even as I said them. "Not what I think," he said, his voice cracking. "Are you serious right now?" The look on his face, hurt, betrayal, disgust, was like a punch to the gut. I tried to reach for him, but he stepped back, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "How long has this been going on?" he demanded, his voice shaking. "How long have you been sneaking around behind my back?" "It wasn't like that," I said, my voice pleading. "It just happened." Ethan let out a bitter laugh, his face twisted with anger. "It just happened? Are you hearing yourself right now?" "Ethan, I started, but he cut me off." "Don't," he said, his voice cold. "Don't say anything else." He turned to Luke, his expression hard. "And you're supposed to be my friend." "Ethan, I didn't mean," Luke began, but Ethan didn't let him finish. "Get out," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Both of you, get out of my face." Luke hesitated, looking at me, but I couldn't meet his eyes. Finally, he nodded and walked toward the door. He paused for a moment as if he wanted to say something, but then he left without another word. Ethan didn't look at me as he stormed down the hallway, slamming his door shut behind him. The house fell silent, the weight of what had just happened settling over me like a shroud. That night, I sat alone in the living room, my chest hollow and aching. I'd spent years building a life I thought was stable, unshakable, and in a single moment it had all come crashing down. I didn't know if it was possible to fix any of it, or if I even deserved to.